The Fabulous Moolah is the final documentary in Viceland's Dark Side of the Ring series, at least for season 1. This is the final episode. There were 6 ones produced. Hopefully they do more. The ratings are good, so hopefully we get a second season because I've really enjoyed this. And this documentary is not necessarily my favorite, but it was very fair. Some people thought this was going to be a hit piece on Moolah. Others thought this was going to be like a WWE-produced revisionist history retelling bullshit that they do. It's not a WWE documentary. It's not going to be WWE polish in which they twist the narrative to make themselves look good. It was something where Moolah has 2 sides. I would say it's more negative than positive. The first half was positive, fairly positive. The second half is extremely negative. And I believe you hear sides of stories of wrestlers who have interacted with her and have had different experiences. The majority of the women all admit, though, I mean, it's not admit, you don't have to admit, it was fact. Moolah screwed you. She took your money. She took 25%. In the 80s, where how women's wrestling were treated, it might necessarily seem as big of a scam, but now when you look back on it, the idea of professional wrestlers losing 25% of their pay to, a trainer, and she owned the woman, and she came off like a pimp because of those accusations. And it wasn't necessarily that she was selling them in prostitution or anything like that. The idea of her owning the woman. They all had to go through her. They all had to work with her. She trained them. She owned them. It was like she was like, and she took a lot of their money, and that's what a lot of heat. Look when you look back on the Fabulous Moolah. So we start this documentary with several female wrestlers. Some of them are ripping her. Wendy Richter hates her. Princess Victoria hates her. Those 2 in particular really are angry with her. He had some of the other ones defending her. We meet her daughter early on. Her daughter is named Meryl Austin. And we also see a woman wrestler who's going to defend her. Her name is Selena Major. That was not her wrestling name, but we're going to call her Selena in this documentary. That's what they go by. But she really looked up to Moolah, and she's extremely positive. You also have a male who, I forgot his name to be honest. He is writing this story about how the Fabulous Moolah should be remembered more positively. He's defending her. He's her biggest defender. He's featured. I thought when he was first showed, I thought we were going to see him a lot more. He was very, to be honest, only a couple months of screen time. So I thought this whole documentary he was going to have a big part, but he had a smaller part. We see her transgression. She was champ for 28 years, long reign as champion, owning all the women and training them. We hear about the Moolah house in which all the women were there to train, and they lived there, and she'd send them out to promoters. Then we get into the first controversy, which was the Fabulous Moolah Battle Royal controversy from WrestleMania last year, 34. The women were supposed to have their own Battle Royal on the pre-show. It was going to be called the Fabulous Moolah Memorial Battle Royal because the men's Battle Royal is called the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal. So they wanted a woman to feature. And she was passed away, and Vince McMahon looks at her like a grandmother. They love her. The McMahons love her. And, of course, online is where wrestling fans have heard the stories of Moolah being a pimp. They've heard the stories of Moolah owning the woman, taking 25% of the pay. They've heard the horror stories, in particular the Sweet Georgia Brown story, which is a nightmare. They've heard the horror stories Wendy Richter has told about her. So all of that begins to surface, and there is just a shitstorm. And I've known about this. I haven't necessarily known that she was a pimp, but I've known the horror stories. She was a rotten person. That's how I perceived her. And the mob on social media can be rough, especially in wrestling fans. It gets all over Twitter, and fans start attacking WWE sponsor Snickers, and Snickers is unhappy, so they tell WWE to fix this, and WWE changes it, and they just call it the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. So that was a big story, and without that, there's no way I think this documentary happens, because without that, we probably don't hear the real story of the Fabulous Moolah other than shoot interviews. So the first part, there's 3 sections, really. You have Sweet Georgia Brown, you have Princess Victoria, and you have Wendy Richter. Sweet Georgia Brown has passed away, and we hear from her 2 children, Michael McCoy, who is now a pastor at a church. It's an African-American church. And you have Barbara Harsey, who I don't know what her relationship with her brother is, but she is the daughter of Sweet Georgia Brown. And we hear a lot from them. So Sweet Georgia Brown was African-American. She was the first black women's wrestler, I believe, at least in the South for sure. And she came up in the 50s and the 60s. This is racism at its worst in the United States. You have the Klan, the KKK, around there, and they would tell stories in which Sweet Georgia Brown would go into a bar and she'd be attacked by Klan members. They'd attack newspaper articles. They'd put the N-word next to her name. So she was treated very poorly by some Klan members at that time, and racist in the South. She is someone who had to give up a lot of her pay to Moolah. Moolah trained her. She trained her in her house. And Brown's daughter, she tells a story of almost a horror story of her holding on to her mom and a Moolah and a male promoter attacking her and slamming her head into the door. It seems, I remember hearing a story once in an article, it seemed like the biggest horror story. She tells it now, it seems like as if she was pushed into the car and it could have been an accident, she hit her head. That story made me think a little bit differently about the one I initially read about Sweet Georgia Brown. But the daughter is someone who believes a lot about Moolah. She never necessarily says Moolah's a pimp, but her mother slept around in the business, and that's what you did at the time. She had to drink alcohol, she did drugs. Alcohol and drugs are a part of the business, so it's not hard to necessarily blame that on Moolah, but certainly you can make your assumptions about her sleeping with promoters. And there's a part where the daughter and the son talk about how they were both harassed in the South, not just because they were black, but because they were biracial. The son's biracial, you can tell, and the daughter, I believe, is biracial. And Sweet Georgia Brown slept with the white men. There was no black promoters at the time, so she was sleeping with white promoters, and she was coming home pregnant. She had multiple kids. We hear from two of them, but she had a lot. And she has her two kids because, and again, they're half white, so they're biracial, and they're harassed in the South. And the son is talking about how he found out who his father was. He found out who his father was through the Fabulous Moolah. And the son is a bit more positive. He's far more positive. He's far more protective of Moolah than the daughter. The daughter is obviously angry, and angry for the right reasons, of every right to be. But Buddy Lee, who was a promoter with the Moolah, he worked with Moolah a lot. He was Michael, that's his father. So we hear a lot about that. They leave it open. They don't necessarily say they think Moolah was a pimp, all those horror stories, but certainly Sweet Georgia Brown passed away, and it was tough on the children. So we hear some more wrestlers talk about how they worked with Moolah in the house and that she trained everyone. And someone who talks a lot about this is Princess Victoria. She tells the story of the brutal training, having to vomit because she'd work them to hell, and she'd leave buckets outside of the ring and he had to vomit outside. That was wrestling at the time. So again, unfair to just blame that all on Moolah. That's how the business was at the time. Ric Flair told the story of that nightmare of that firehouse carry with Greg Vern Gagne. That's what they did, but Moolah trained them brutal, and the thing with them is all the male wrestlers were getting paid despite the brutal training. Moolah was taking your money. 25% of your paycheck costs Princess Victoria a lot of money. She has every right to be as bitter as she is. She's unhappy, and she has every right to be. The thing you hear is the story about this broken neck. So she hurts her neck, Victoria hurts it, and it's broken. She's in the hospital. Next thing she knows, she suddenly wakes up and she's in Moolah's house. And she lives at the house. And she's at the home in the room, and Moolah's telling her to talk about wrestling again. She is furious. She is mad at Moolah, and she tells the story of Moolah almost telling her to sleep with a promoter. And it's interesting because she almost insinuates it's a prostitution ring. She is insinuating that. But then later, I'll get to this later in the end credits, she completely denies, no, Moolah's not a pimp. You said she told you to basically sleep up with a promoter and almost insinuated that. It's hard, Princess Victoria really contradicts herself here. She even tells a story of after she quits, Moolah wants her to wrestle with a broken neck. She's refusing for obvious reasons. She has a broken fucking neck, and she tells her no, and she gets into a fight with the promoter on the phone, and that's where Moolah makes the remark, the nicer you are to him, the nicer he'll be to you. What happens is after she quits, Moolah tells the other woman that she is going to prison for dealing cocaine. So that tells you the kind of person Moolah is. And of the woman, her and Wendy Richter very unhappy with Fabulous Moolah. And I can understand a lot more with Richter, and with Princess Victoria, again, she did contradict herself a lot. So Wendy Richter was introduced earlier, but she's now the focus. It's the third part. And Wendy Richter was a big star. She was beautiful in the 80s. She still looks really good now. And she makes a joke that her father once said is that you couldn't put Moolah's face on dog food and sell it. So she's very unhappy. And she absolutely believes that Fabulous Moolah was jealous of her, and that's 100% true. There's no denying that. If you think that Fabulous Moolah wasn't jealous of Wendy Richter, you're out of your mind. It's obvious. Come on. She is really talking about the rock and wrestling boom, and of course you had MTV, which was a huge part with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T during the lead up to WrestleMania 1, but also a huge part was Cyndi Lauper, and she talks about her involvement with Cyndi Lauper. Wendy Richter and Cyndi Lauper became an alliance, and Cyndi Lauper got connected to wrestling through Captain Lou Albano, who she had a relationship with, and who I believe she worked for, I think Lou managed her. And Captain Lou Albano appears in one of the most famous music videos of all time, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. He's in that video. Wendy Richter and Cyndi Lauper they're like a tag team. They're not, Cyndi wasn't wrestling, but that's how they're presented. And she goes into the match with the Fabulous Moolah, the 28-year reign of the champion. Vince McMahon wants to make Wendy Richter into a huge star, and they have her beat Moolah. She wins the title. It's an amazing moment. It's huge. She's a superstar. All of these amazing moments lead into the first WrestleMania. That's where you have Wendy Richter facing Lonnie Kai, who we don't get to see much in this documentary until near the end. We didn't get a physical interview with her. I think that would have been interesting. So as Wendy Richter becomes a big star post-WrestleMania, she beats Lonnie Kai. Cyndi Lauper appeared. They had a big entrance at the first WrestleMania. They celebrate in the ring together. It gets a lot of media attention. Cyndi Lauper's a huge star. Princess Victoria makes the claim that Wendy Richter is as big as Hulk Hogan, which is absolute bullshit, but she was a star. But not like that. Vince McMahon doesn't want to pay her like the top male stars, and that's the narrative. So he decides he has to get the belt off her, but he has no one to beat her. What he does is he works with Moolah, and they organize a way to get the belt off of Wendy. And what they do is they have the Spider Lady. And they had Spider Lady before in which Wendy would beat Spider Lady. By this time it was Moolah, and Wendy realized it looked different. This is the original screw job. Spider Lady pins Fabulous Moolah 1, 2, 3. It's bullshit. It's not as crazy as Montreal, what would happen years later, 12 years later, but it is a bullshit ending. It's a roll-up, but she kicks out, and it's 1, 2, 3. And it's a good thing Vince didn't use that finish from Montreal, because that's what he wanted to do. Wendy Richter is furious. She is extremely angry. Vince McMahon thinks Moolah can just handle Wendy Richter, and she probably would have at the time, because Moolah was tough. Wendy Richter is looking for Vince McMahon backstage. She can't find him, and she just tells the story of how furious she is, and she has a right to be. She was extremely angry at the company, and we didn't see her return for 25 years, in which she was inducted to the Hall of Fame in 2010. That's the last time we saw her, but she is very angry with them, and she had every right to be, and that's a horrible way for her career to finish. So we end the documentary with the one being divided. Wendy Richter knows she held women's wrestling down. Princess Victoria believes if Wendy Richter was champion, women's wrestling would have exploded. Jim Cornette tells that story as well, of how Moolah held it down, and had Wendy been a star, it could have expanded. And he tells a story. Jim Cornette's right, because women's MMA had a huge part of women's wrestling becoming popular. But he had Sweet Georgia Brown. Her daughter says she has no opinion of Fabulous Moolah, but I think we know what her real opinion is. Lalani Kai did a telephone interview, and she defended Moolah. You had other women wrestlers defending her. They're all really appreciating of her, but you had a lot of them attacking her as well. How she would take your money, and how she would just have control over all the women. And it ends with Princess Victoria completely denouncing the rumors of Fabulous Moolah being a pimp and her using women in prostitution rings or anything like that. But it was interesting. It was a fair documentary. It wasn't necessarily a hit piece, but it was honest in a lot of perspectives of a lot of wrestlers who had to deal with her. So overall, I enjoyed it. Not my favorite Dark Side of the Ring episode, but I still think it's very good. If you want to learn more about the story, you should watch it.